I hate passwords. Let me restate that. I really hate passwords. Wait, let me restate that again. I hate passwords. Ugh! Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. This episode has been coming for a very long time. It may be a first world problem, but one of the things I hate the most in the whole world is passwords. And by that, I specifically mean computer passwords, of course. So just to put this in perspective, I have an office computer, I have my own personal computer, desktop computer, I have a laptop computer, I have an iPhone, I have an iPad, and I have 2 television sets. Oh, and also my Tesla with its display screen and everything. And within all of that, website-wise and everything, there are literally hundreds of websites that I have passwords to for one reason or another. And of course, there's apps on my phone that also have passwords. So some people will say, hey, password managers make everything okay. They don't. They actually increase the problem. The issue is that, let's say on my desktop computer, which doesn't have any biometric sensors, I type my password in over and over again every time I log into that computer. So it's just automated. It's almost like muscle memory at that point, right? The issue is that, let's say I go on my banking website. Well, it's automatically filled in by the password manager. So every time I go in, it just automatically does that. But then inevitably I get on another computer, or there comes a time when for some reason that thing fails and it asks me for the password. And at that point, I can't even remember anymore. And that's my banking password, which is something I keep track of pretty carefully. There's also Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, of course, and then of course weird sites like doodle.com for polls, and Etsy, and a Logi site, which is like a nursery so that you can order plants and things. And I recently went on there, and I hadn't ordered anything for a couple of years from Logi's, but it had a password, but the password was wrong. So then I had to go through that entire process of the whole password reset and everything. And perhaps the worst part of all of this is useless because it's completely insecure and it doesn't work. Data breaches happen all the time, and they are very severe, and they often depend upon the fact that us human beings, we're just terrible at passwords. I mean, we don't memorize things. What's pi to the 15th digit? Somebody tell me. I'm sure there's one person out there who can. Right? It's 3.1415926 something, right? Or the value of E, 2.71 something, or just random numbers like that. Your social security number you probably remember because you practice it a lot, and your telephone number as well. But can you tell me the telephone number of your best friend from childhood if you're over like 25 or 30 years old? Probably not anymore, right? So human beings are terrible at remembering random sequences of letters and numbers. One thing, of course, you might ask is, where the hell did this all come from? I actually have an article. I'll link it in the description. It's from Wired. I think it's back in 2012. Let me look. Yes. January of 2012, and it talks about the origins of the password. So as you might expect, it was in the 1960s, and it was MIT, according to everyone's best guess. I'm going to read a couple of quotes from the article. And by the way, the title of this article is "The World's First Computer Password, ? It was useless too." So I'm not the only one who has issues with computer passwords. So the question is, where did the first computer password come from? Of course, there were passwords previously, like, Roman army people would use it. They'd have to give the password to get into the city or something. So there were passwords previous to this, but where did the first computer password specifically come from? Quote, "It probably arrived at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the mid-1960s when researchers at the university built a massive time-sharing computer called CTSS. The punchline is that even then, passwords didn't protect users as well as they could have. Technology changes, but then again, it doesn't." CTSS, or Compatible Time Sharing System, was the system that actually began a whole bunch of things that we recognize today as modern computing, like email, virtual machines, instant messaging, file sharing, etc., etc. So it was a really big deal, and it also started the dreaded password. Again, quote, "According to Fernando Corbato, even though the MIT computer hackers were breaking new ground with much of what they did, passwords were pretty much a no-brainer." Quote, inside the quote, "The key problem was that we were setting up multiple terminals which were to be used by multiple persons, but with each person having his own private set of files," unquote, he told Wired. Again, quote, Putting a password on for each individual user as a lock seemed like a very straightforward solution, end quote. So why were passwords picked as opposed to something else like a knowledge-based system, like asking your mother's maiden name or something like that? Well, of course, a lot of it came down to computer resources. Computers were very, very memory constrained at the time, and a password just took up 8 characters or something like that, as opposed to the potentially much, much larger knowledge-based system that might be utilized instead. Again, quoting the Wired article, quote, "The irony is that the MIT researchers who pioneered passwords didn't really care much about security. CTSS may also have been the first system to experience a data breach. One day in 1966, a software bug jumbled up the system's welcome message and its master password file so that anyone who logged in was presented with the entire list of CTSS passwords." End quote. You gotta love that. That just sounds like something, I remember the Sony breach and other breaches. It's like that, things change, but they stay the same, right? The better story was from a few years earlier, however. Quote, "In the spring of 1962, Scher was looking for a way to bump up his usage time on CTSS. He had been allotted 4 hours per week, but it wasn't nearly enough time to run the detailed performance simulations he'd designed for the new computer system. So he simply printed out all of the passwords stored on the system. Quote, there was a way to request files to be printed offline by submitting a punched card," end quote. "Late one Friday night, I submitted a request to print the password files, and very early Saturday morning went to the file cabinet where printouts were placed and took the listing," end quote. So Scher literally printed out the file that had the passwords on it, took it, and then he was able to read off the passwords and basically utilize as much time as he wanted to because he could take other people's time sharing amounts. So anyway, even from the beginning, the very, very first password systems were immediately corruptible and people could steal the passwords, and it was basically useless as a security measure. And yet here we have an entire economy, an entire security, right? A national defense, everything like that is vulnerable to password breaches. So again, human beings are terrible at remembering random strings of numbers and letters. We're really, really bad at it. So what do? We choose simple things that we can remember. So what do data breachers look for? They look for simple things like password or 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's still surprisingly many, many people who use that kind of a system nowadays, even today. And of course, people forget their passwords all the time. So there's an entire back end that's constantly doing the password reset thing, right? I just had this happen to me with Optum. I spent almost a half an hour resetting my password for the bank account that works with my medical insurance stuff. And for those of you outside the United States, medical insurance in the United States is terrible. So be glad that you're not living in the United States for the healthcare. It is really atrocious. But anyway, it took me almost a half an hour to go and reset my password for this stupid account. And of course, now we have things like two-factor authentication and stuff. So they sent my email address a code that I had to put in, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, it does make it more difficult for data hackers or breachers or anything like that to take away our data or to log into a system, but it's by no means impossible, and humans are still by far the weak link, right? Because a computer could memorize these numbers, no problem, but us humans have issues with that, and so we're constantly having to reset our passwords or make simple passwords or reuse passwords. I can't tell you how many times my phone has bitched at me about the fact that I have too easy of a password for some random site. And oftentimes the site, I don't even care about it. Something like Etsy, right? It's like, okay, how often do I use Etsy? But the fact of the matter is, if somebody gets that password, they could get into it and they could potentially breach Etsy or their financial systems or my own personal stuff and find out data about me. So it is quite dangerous, but it's also really easy to be lazy about websites that you don't use that often or you don't think of as that important. And again, password managers seem like a good idea, right? You put your thumbprint in or you look at your phone screen and it does facial recognition and it inserts the passwords automatically. But those are not foolproof. It's like they work like 95% of the time, but 5% they don't. Like you get a new phone and suddenly you have to type in all of your passwords again. And what happens when that happens? Well, then suddenly you have to remember all of these stinking passwords again, or you have to reset all the passwords, which takes a huge amount of time. I actually wonder how much of our economy is devoted to passwords. Like how many work hours do we lose per week, per country, just on people trying to reset passwords or people trying to back-end secure passwords or create systems that allow passwords to be reset, et cetera, et cetera. It's a huge amount of wasted effort. So you might ask, okay, passwords suck and they don't work that well, but we don't have any other choices. I disagree with that. Now, this is just kind of brainstorming, so I don't have all of the answers here, but what are humans really good at remembering? We're good at remembering two things. Number one is stories. We can remember stories. And number two is gossip. And I think some combination of those two things is the answer to this question. So let's consider a hypothetical situation. Let's say that the computer asked you, instead of what is your password, and you're like, oh, good Lord, what password was it that I picked this? I haven't used this website in 2 years. There's no way I'm going to remember this. What if instead it said, why did Uncle Roy divorce Aunt Linda? Well, if you had an Uncle Roy and Aunt Linda slept with the postman or something like that, you are going to remember that to your deathbed. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I am saying that it is very human nature to remember gossip and remember pretty specific details about gossip because we just love schadenfreude. We love when somebody else is unhappy and something bad happens to them. So you could take something like that, or you could ask for a story that the person wrote. So the first time that they create some sort of perhaps a managed account or something, right? So they create an account and they come up with one story that they write themselves. Maybe it's kind of a Mad Lib type of situation. It's like first this happened, then this happened, then this happened or something. And a person creates a story that's interesting to them and has some personal value to them. A person is going to remember that. Or again, a person will remember gossip about somebody else's pain particularly, or a funny incident that happened to you when you were a child, or something along those lines. So what we need to do, and this goes back to, again, I talked about the humane interface in a previous video. I'll link it up here. But Jeff Raskin's book, which sadly is out of print, but you can still get it at Amazon. You can get reprints or used copies of it. I highly recommend reading it. His basic contention is when something is wrong in the world that's designed, right? I'm not talking about a mountain. A mountain is a mountain. But if you go to a door and you push it and it was supposed to be pull, that's not your fault. That's the designer of the door's fault. The door should afford something that indicates that it's supposed to be pulled. And I think we can extend this to passwords. Passwords do not have human affordances. They are not built for human beings. They're built for computers. Computers can remember 1x235 ampersand 7 exclamation mark, right? A computer will remember that no problem. I couldn't even tell you what I just told you a second ago. I'd have to go back and watch the video again. So anyway, that's an affordance for a computer. That is not humane, as Jeff Raskin would say. So what we want is a humane system, something that caters to human beings. We have memory, we have processing power now. Obviously, biometrics is a very major thing, but I think biometrics combined with some sort of storytelling or some sort of gossip-based thing or some sort of historical thing that's pretty unique to an individual with details that you could pull out. So if you think about those reading exercises you did in like high school where they give you a paragraph to read and then they would test you and say like, what did Mrs. Wright say about Mrs. Peters's handbag or something, right? So you're supposed to remember that. If you put that in some sort of emotionally important kind of context, right? So I think that's the important thing is we have to connect emotion to our security. So if we attach something that we have an emotional commitment to or connection to. So again, gossip or a very important story like how did you break your leg when you were 8 years old or something like that. And you can give details about that. And then later on, what the computer can do is it can take the whole thing and it can ask for one or two details out of that story. And you can provide those, whereas, a random, the black hat wearing hacker cannot provide those details because that person doesn't know. Now, of course, that depends on the computer to encrypt that data and everything like that, but let's just assume that that's quite reasonable because generally speaking, computers are pretty good at this stuff. It's the human beings that are the weak point of this chain. So anyway, something along the lines of that is what my suggestion is. At the very least, we need to really reconsider. I think everybody has just gotten to the point where they're like, oh, passwords are just a necessary evil in life. They are not. They're absolutely not. We can get rid of passwords. And I think that the person who really ultimately gets rid of passwords with a good system is not only going to become hopefully a very wealthy person, but also will be a hero to the world. And I, for one at least, will give them a huge pat on the back. All right, I hope you found this little rant fun and interesting. If you did, definitely make sure you like it so other people can find it, and also subscribe for more of this. Also, as always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon. You all are the best. You can join them if you look in the description. And of course, don't forget about our merch store, which has this awesome Tesla bot hoodie, plus a whole bunch of other clothes and tumblers and things like that. So definitely check that out. That's in the description as well. A big thank you to Zenly Music for doing the intro and conclusion music. And don't forget that we are Tesla and Amazon affiliates. If you click the links in the description, you help out the channel. Simple as that. Thank you. And as always, please feel free to ask me questions in the comments or at my email address, which is drknowitallknows@gmail.com. Till next time, bye-bye.